Oh. Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I know that the weather has not really cooperated, and so hoping that we'll have more folks trickling in as we begin. But I wanted to welcome you all to CAPAL's Washington Leadership Program. I am Shama Ahmed, and I currently serve as the Managing Director at the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership. Tonight is our final WLP of the summer, so I'm glad that you all were able to make it out. So a little introduction to CAPAL. At CAPAL, we cultivate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander AANHPI public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. This includes our annual public service scholarship and internship program, a roundtable series, a mentorship program, and tonight's Washington Leadership Program, which is one of CAPAL's signature programs and also one of the programs that I think has run the longest time, so about 30 plus years now. Our 2024 WLP was pulled together by a group of recent scholar and intern alumni. They put in a lot of hours and many weeks prior to the summer to come together and brainstorm ideas of topic sessions and themes and speaker suggestions. So they really put in a lot of effort into putting the series together. For tonight's session, we're excited to welcome Gisela, Kusakawa, Bob Sakaniwa, Kareena, Salvi, and Nancy Yap to our panel discussion tonight. Tonight's session is 2024 elections, where we'll discuss topics such as AANHPI voter bloc, the various career paths to get involved in the electoral process and political organizing, as well as addressing how to mobilize voters to show up for their communities. There's going to be an audience survey that will follow the panel discussion, and panelists will respond to an audience Q&A as well. We also invite attendees to stay after the session for a mini networking session. So until we have time to close out, we encourage you to follow and join our conversation tonight on social media and use the hashtag #WeAreCAPAL, using hashtag #WeAreCAPAL. And finally, thank you to our speakers and panelists this evening for spending their time with us, and to all of you for joining us. A very special thank you to our 2024 sponsor, the DC Mayor's Office on Asian Pacific Islander Affairs, also known as MOAPIA, for making programs like tonight's possible for CAPAL. I am thrilled to now hand it over to Gisela, our moderator for tonight's panel discussion. Gisela is the Executive Director of Asian American Scholar Forum. AASF endeavors to protect the rights of Asian American and immigrant and promote academic belongings and openness, freedom, and equity for all. She was most recently the director of the Anti-Profiling Civil Rights and National Security Program, formerly the Anti-Racial Profiling Project, at Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC. And she also serves on the board of directors at CAPAL. Gisela, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shimo. Welcome, everyone. I know there was a bit of a storm out there, so we really appreciate you all making the trek today. As you know, it's a very important election year, and so we have here today panelists who are really on the ground working to make sure that we have great voter turnout, that this is really one that the Asian American community can have a really strong voice for. And so it's such a pleasure for me to first introduce our first two panelists from APIAVote. We have here Bob Sakaniwa, Director of Policy and Advocacy, and also Kareena Salvi, Youth Engagement and Field Associate at APIAVote. I'll let them further introduce themselves and their organizations.
Great, thanks so much, Gisela. And it's such a pleasure to be here, in part because many years ago, I was, when I first got to this town, I joined CAPAL because, there were a lot fewer Asian Americans coming to this town and taking advantage of a lot of the opportunities that are here. I wasn't an intern. I came working for a member of Congress, but like Shaima was saying, the CAPAL members, work year round to help raise funds and then plan out this really fantastic summer leadership program. And it's become so much more professional than in our day. We were just a bunch of volunteers back then, and just really encouraged to see how the organization has grown and really become quite a resource. But even when it was just us volunteers, we had a chance to network with people on the Hill, people in the administration, as well as people working in town. So kudos to everybody taking advantage of the opportunities that CAPAL provides. A little bit about myself. As Gisela said, I'm at APIAVote now as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. And I've had many other jobs here in this town. Before APIAVote, I was actually working in immigration policy for a number of years. Prior to that, I worked in Congressman Mike Honda's office. And, going even further back, I worked at the Japanese American Citizens League. So many hats in this town, but each, gave me new insight into kind of the workings of the town and how different ways of promoting and making change in policy. So, but if you've been in this town as long as I have, it's inevitable. I'm going to let Kareena introduce herself quickly, and then we'll talk a little bit about APIAVote and what we do. But Kareena, please.
Well, hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you. You can all hear us, right? By the way, just making sure. And really grateful to CAPAL as well. And thank you all for making this happen and organizing this. So a little bit about myself. My name's Kareena Salvi. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have a different journey, I guess, from Bob a little bit. I'm going to eventually get those hats on, hopefully. I'm from Jersey, so I'm currently based in DC for APIAVote. As the Youth Engagement and Field Associate, I'll go over that first and then go a little bit about myself. But with this role, especially, I oversee more civic engagement and youth programming, and I think we'll talk more about that in depthly of what that looks like. And we have one of our APIAVote youth ambassadors here, so definitely will be shedding light on their work. But other than that, for me, I graduated from Drew University. I don't know if anyone knows where that is. It's very small. It's in New Jersey, and I studied political science, majored in poli-sci with minors in Spanish, dance, and law, justice, and society. Our college was very different from a lot of others where you can just make your own route or create it or have a plethora of options. And for me, I specialize more in hate crime data collection and racial politics, specifically studying more second generation identity development for the Asian population, I would say. But most of my research has been with Dr. Sanjay Mishra or Janelle Wong with the second generation South Asian political identity movement, and basically understanding, why Asians in particular are, I would say, second generation folks, why they believe in what they believe and how. And most of the racial politics or hate crime data work was with SIC Coalition for the state of New York. So handling a lot of casework, especially obviously post 9/11 and even now. But I think that's like a general gist, and generally have always done community organizing. I came from a home where my family was very supportive and also full of activists. Back from India, we have roots in India where there's a lot of activism work there. So I think it's kind of ingrained in my blood to do that work. But yeah, I think that's a little bit about me.
Great. So we have just a few slides to go through real quickly to tell you a little bit more about APIAVote. Next slide. So we're a national organization based here in DC, and but the way we reach the many communities that we try to target is through trusted messengers in those communities. So talking about Asian American Pacific Islander serving nonprofits that are based in the community. They might do direct service in any number of different areas, but we also, by partnering with them, we get them to prioritize civic engagement as another part of the programming that they do through all the other good work that they do. And so we're in about 29, 30 different states with these partners who we work hand in hand with in order to create target lists so we can get people registered, get them out to vote, and all the classic civic engagement activities. Next slide. Thanks. So we have 4 main components, but fundamentally, I'll say, we were founded in 2008. Our current executive director, Christine Chen, has almost been there the whole time. And it started out kind of her and maybe 1 or 2 other staff people, and then a ton of volunteers. But through the years, she kind of got everything done, but keeping that small structure. But in the last few years, we've actually grown, and now we're up to maybe 15 staff. And so certainly in the past 3 years, we've kind of made the commitment to grow the organization. And so now we are more structured. We have our kind of 4 main departments. The bread and butter, of course, is our field program. Our national field program is the program that does all our outreach with the community partners that we have throughout the country. Of course, communications is a vital part, messaging, getting our message out there. Youth is kind of a part of the field program, but it's really such an important component that it's broken out as a distinct programming area. And then finally, the policy and advocacy department. That's kind of the newest department in our organization, because when you're working the field organizing, working with community groups, there hadn't been as much time or ability to focus on different policy issues, whether on Capitol Hill or within state capitals. But we made a concerted effort, made a clear decision that we want to be more engaged in the policy space. So the department was created in the last few years as well. Next slide. So again, this just kind of shows in purple where we have community partners, and we have the obvious areas, West Coast, East Coast, Florida, Texas, but then more and more obviously with the migration and immigration patterns of the API community, we're finding pockets in places like Utah and Iowa, and we're trying to establish a partner in Alabama. So we're continually looking for where our new pockets of voters are going to be coming from. Next slide. Is this you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess
Thanks.
briefly too, just want to be mindful of time. So for the youth ambassador program, at least, so this is talking more about APIAVote's youth programming sector that Bob was touching on. So for example, for the youth sector, right, it mirrors field team. So briefly, it's more like, it's not just about voter engagement, right? I don't think voting is like the one thing that you can do. I think voting's the action that gets you in this steer wheel, like this continuous wheel of civic engagement, all right? And that word's constantly thrown around. And I feel like Nancy, as well as the rest of us, will talk more about what does that actually mean. It's like kind of a buffer word that's just thrown everywhere. But for this, right, like the work we do is really teaching students and giving them this opportunity to learn how to be an organizer in your state. What does it mean to be a community organizer, right? Everything that students, like, the power is really within the youth. And I know people say that, but I feel like not everyone has that fortunate privilege, for example, of being in this room or even participating in said so program. So we have this program where youth participate, they learn about how to be an organizer in your particular state, right? Because that varies based on legislation or policies or voting barriers. And then you also build a voter engagement action plan template as well that you receive from us. And through this, you build a relationship with a lot of other students across the nation that participate. But the big takeaway is you'll have a community, you learn how to build a community, you learn how to talk to people, right? I think post-COVID, it's been difficult for a lot of youth to engage with other folks. And one of our students ambassadors is here who participated in our town hall and summit where we did an in-person training. But I don't want to take too much time away too from the actual conversation. But if anyone has questions, definitely feel free to hang out after.
Thank you so much, Kareena and Bob. I next turn to Nancy Yap. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment. Thank you for joining us, Nancy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's fun to still be able to participate, even though I'm all the way here in Los Angeles. Yeah, but I also just want to share a little bit about myself as we go into this conversation and a little bit about CAUSE for anybody who's not very familiar with our organization. We're a civic engagement organization based in California. We have Southern California focus and are located in Little Tokyo. So have an opportunity to really interact with a lot of different ethnic communities here and ethnic neighborhoods here with a focus on voter education and civic leadership training. Our programming ranges. So we do have student programming. We're in the middle of our summer internship program where we place students at various locations, mostly legislative offices. And then we also have an all year round. So we do a fall and a spring that really focuses on getting voter education out. And I think that for us, really, especially this year, really looking at what voter education looks like, the kind of events we can have, and what that means. I would be remiss if I didn't share a little bit about our Leadership Academy. I'll share my screen real quick. Here we go. So you should all be able to see it, but yeah, just wanted to let you all know that we also have a summer program that's specifically for students. It's for students to get an opportunity to see what it's like to work in a legislative office, what kind of careers they can have in government, as well as really think about tangibly what could it look like to either help on a campaign, work on a campaign, or even run for office themselves. This year we have 14 students placed at a variety of offices from federal to state to local cities. And they've all had different experiences with engaging with stakeholders and getting to know their communities. The program consists of workshops, this internship office placement, but also a civic engagement project that is actually structured like a mock campaign. And so they have a chance to have different roles in their campaign as well. And then the last thing I kind of just wanted to take into consideration is as we really think about what it means to participate in these programs, we know for a lot of young folks, it helps to hear, and I think even for me, to understand what the experience is really like is actually about having them share along the way what is resonating with them, some of the things they're learning, and who they're learning it from. So much of the work we do at CAUSE is about learning from each other and understanding what it feels like to be in these community spaces, and really trying to not just be ourselves, be authentic to who we are, but also engage with folks who come from such diverse communities, and that Asian and Pacific Islander America is very diverse in its structure. So a lot of our conversations are rooted around that. I really encourage folks to go to our website and read about the stories of our students here in our internship program. On that, I'll stop sharing and hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Well, as Shaima mentioned, CAPAL is really about helping you all find your passion and interest and bridging you towards public sector work. That can include federal government, nonprofit work. So we wanted to kind of take a step back from voting and talk more personally. What first inspired or drew you to work in the sector you are currently in? And how would you describe the pathway that led to where you are today? Maybe I'll start with you, Bob. I know you wore a lot of hats. So.
That's a great question, and I think for me personally, it was a much more meandering path. I had studied poli-sci as an undergrad. I worked for a couple of years, went to law school in Los Angeles at Loyola. I'm not pushing law school, but it is it is a common background in this town for a lot of people. But after that, I was able to work on a campaign for a person who was running for Congress for the first time. And I had never been exposed to a campaign or any sort of political work. So, but it was an intriguing opportunity, and I saw it as a way of possibly going from LA to back east to Washington, D.C. if everything worked out with the person I was working for. And of course, he did win. And so, you know, that kind of started my time in DC. And really, I think, you know, I didn't start those many years ago thinking, oh, you know, I'm working my way to civic engagement and voting rights issues. But, you know, you work on the Hill, you get exposed to a lot of different issues and ways of advocating for those issues. You see all the groups that are behind pushing the issue. And so it just gave me a much broader sense of the kind of activities that happen in this town. I then worked in civil rights a little bit through JCL. I then, you know, went back to the Hill later to work for Mike Honda. And in his office, I had a lot of exposure to immigration issues. So that led me to immigration policy. And I did that for a long time for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, but focused on getting comprehensive immigration reform passed. Like many battles in this town, they can last decades. But then, you know, after kind of getting, you know, burned out in immigration and really needing to take a breather, I did take some time off. And then, you know, while I was just kind of trying to figure out what next, I bumped into Christine Chen again, who I had known initially when she was an intern in this town, along with when I first got to this town. And so it's kind of a lesson in all the networking and connections you make and how important it is to stay connected to the extent possible, because you never know whose path you're going to cross again, and may, you know, find an opportunity there. And, you know, sure enough, she wanted to have APIAVote get more established in policy work. And so even though I had no voting rights background, she needed somebody who had been in this town for a while, understood, you know, how policy works in this town. And so it just kind of worked out from there. So again, it was a meandering, circuitous route to this spot, but that's how I got here.
Well, that's great, Bob. I mean, Bob and Christine really set up APIAVote from the ground up. So a big thank you, because that was a missing gap within the Asian American civil rights space. I will pitch a career in law. I won't go into it, but I'm the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association co-chair for our Civil Rights Committee. And there's so many benefits in going into the legal profession. You can go work into public sector, private sector, back and forth. You can really hop around, but what I find the most meaningful is that directly impacted persons, you're much more able to work with them closely, because, you know, as you may know, if someone is directly impacted, they can't share their full story with just anyone, right? There's attorney-client privilege. And so you're put in a very unique position where you may know more about a person than their wife or children. And you're really in a great place to support them and help them navigate the legal space. So I will pitch that as part of an additional skill set within the nonprofit space. Next, I'll turn to Kareena. If you could share a little bit about your journey.
I think for what I'll say both, I guess, what inspired and drew. I think for me, like, again, really enjoyed the policy advocacy work over the years in college, at least, whether it be organizing or even like for the state of New Jersey. I was on student government in college, and I think our college campus was one of the colleges in New Jersey that took the leading efforts in implementing anti-racism training for New Jersey across all colleges. And I think it's so far past in a few colleges. But with that, I think why I was drawn to this work in general, I think was mostly because of my personal life, to be transparent. I think growing up in New Jersey, yes, it's a very multi-ethnic, beautiful place, but I think there was a lot of adversity that my family and I had faced, or I had seen, especially from my friends. A lot of my friends were either outside the US, whether it be college or even high school. So I had a lot of Sudanese friends, a lot of friends from the African diaspora, as well as just a lot of South Asian friends as well. And I think with that, there was a lot of issues that happened in high school, whether it be uh, issues within our local town or through other parties that were involved. So I think through that, those experiences really shaped my childhood, especially being like a 14-year-old person and seeing like a lot of things where, you know, police's interactions with students on our high school and such, because it was just whatever issue was happening. So I think all of those drew me into college and shaped my college experience a lot. And I think in college is where I really took the reins, because that's like, right, college is the time where your life is kind of in your hands to some extent and you get to craft it. So for me, that's when I went to student government. I didn't even think I was going to go to college, to be honest. And then I ended up there and I found out student government, ended up becoming president, ended up realizing like, oh, I can have all these opportunities to, you know, understand not just, it's not about hierarchy, it's more about listening to people's stories, right? So that's where that element, like if you think of that little line from the timeline I'm talking right now, that's what I drew as like a core element that I wanted to bring into my life post grad, right? So that's tied to APIAVote, where I'm talking to students. I'm able to really listen to students and their family stories, like as like Christine's like letting me travel to different states and different universities, talking to different students about their experiences in their particular state, their experience with voter engagement, their experience with politics in the US, and or even like international politics bleeding into the US and such, and shaping their relationship, right? So with that, I'm able to really listen and hear more about what their stories are, which is something that I would have wished I had growing up, and I didn't. But I think because of those experiences I had as a child, or like literally a high school student or even elementary school, shaped me now, like in my early 20s, like understanding what pathway I wanted. And that pathway, again, to clarify, is advocacy work and community organizing and listening to the stories, but also with the privilege that I have and the job that I have, fortunately, right? I'm able to actually talk to the people that make those changes, whether or not they make the decision to agree to listen to the students, or even communities like Asian community across the nation. The fact is that I'm able to have that conversation in the first place, right? And I think that's like the policy advocacy side to it both. So I think I would say my own personal experiences as well as everyone else's that I've seen across my life. And I would consider their stories that they've shared with me not part of my life, but have built me, again, my character and my mindset.
Thank you so much, Kareena. Nancy, now you're in an executive role, which is often known for burnout. And so it'd be great to hear from you. What inspired you to be in the pathway you are right now?
Sure. And, I think burnout is an interesting journey. I feel like because we're talking to, like, we want inspired to be in these roles. I want more people to want my job. I would really love that. But to be honest, like, I think it's partly when we choose to do things we're passionate about, it sometimes becomes more work because we are actually really committed. I feel very fortunate that so many people I have the opportunity to collaborate with and engage with really love what they do. I feel fortunate that my jobs in the past have led me to meet people like Shaima, who was in one of our leadership programs at my old job, and then in my current job, Angel, who is also there and one of the students at CAPAL's internship. And so I just love meeting all the people I meet, and I think I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. To talk about how I ended up here specifically at Cause, here specifically around voting, I will say 10 years ago, voting was not something I was interested in. I was doing community work, I had been in arts activist spaces, and for me, I just didn't know if my voice really was being heard. A lot of my friends were very passionate about it, and so I would vote because I was supposed to. But here I am, someone who's very engaged in the community, someone who does a lot of work in AANHPI spaces, who's been doing leadership development training for almost 20 years. And I just didn't know if voting mattered either. And I ended up just kind of continuing to do the work that I felt passionate about. And I found myself in a program that a few folks here in Los Angeles were putting together around getting civically engaged locally. It was called API Civic U. And I was like, you know what? Some of the people I really looked up to were part of advocating for and planning it. So I attended. I had an opportunity to hear from a lot of elected officials and people who had shaped LA City, LA County, people who were really passionate about local government. And after the program, I decided to, and I would say I agreed to run for neighborhood council. Very small local government role that feeds into the city council infrastructure here in Los Angeles City. It really just felt like a club I agreed to be in. I felt like I was on this board. We listened to people's concerns about our neighborhoods. But really, I wasn't sure that it was for me. When the pandemic hit, though, what I discovered is there are a lot of resources and networks that were in place to help our communities, but a lot of folks didn't have access to them. We were seeing a lot of challenges on the ground. I'm sure many of you saw them around language access for relief funds, unemployment funds, PPP, right? Like, I think that we wanted to see more access for our communities, and it was just happening at the rate we needed it to. So a lot of nonprofits were on the ground translating. Meanwhile, my neighborhood council was like, we're not sure what to do. We want to give the money somewhere where it will help someone. And they knew that I was plugged in. And the neighborhood council had the ability to give out emergency funds. They gave me and a local business owner $3,000 to start a program that was a meals program in Little Tokyo. We focused on trying to help the businesses survive. So our focus was actually buying meals from the restaurants. We have over 100 of them here in Little Tokyo. And then giving the meals back out to hospitality workers, because in addition to the restaurants, we have a lot of stores. It's a very tourist friendly area, right? And in doing that, what I realized is, one, there was access to funds that if I hadn't agreed to be in this government role, I wouldn't have known about. But two, like, with that small amount of money, we were able to create a program that lasted 6 months and raised over $200,000, but also fed over 10,000 people, or gave out 10,000 meals. And if we had access to a network like that, if I had been more plugged in, what could that have looked like? And that's when the opportunity at Cause opened up. I feel like I'm here now because I've seen how local government can matter in a time of real need, and also a real challenge for AANHPI communities, and how important it is for us not only to advocate from the outside, but make sure we have folks on the inside, and that we also vote for the folks we want to be on the inside. And so my tone has definitely changed. I think the pandemic and leading during the pandemic has helped to make that true.
And Nancy, your sort of changing attitude towards voting is such a great segue on this important topic of voter apathy. We know this is something that our communities often grapple with. What's your take on sort of taking a step back on voter apathy as a whole? Why is voting important to you? And if you could share a bit of what challenges do you think exist specifically for AANHPI voters?
Sure. I think for me, there's two parts to the way I think about apathy. And I do think it can be really disheartening. But part of it also is no one said that we only had to do it one way. I think that in voter engagement, voter education can be fun, and that it is up to us that are doing the work to find the ways to make it fun, not just for us, but for the audiences that we are speaking to. And so on one hand, I do think it's about being creative. It's about engaging with artists, really talking about what makes sense. Cause actually, every year we help produce a costume contest at a Halloween party called Haunted Little Tokyo. We have 4,500 people coming in costume, and because we're in Little Tokyo, it's very anime, gaming, focused, and folks feel welcome here, but they also get to vote on their favorite cosplayers. And so we really talk about like why it's important to have a voice, and then with our interns talk about the margin of victory, even how do we get people to vote? Why aren't people voting? Like, and we're doing it at a large Halloween party, right? Like, and so what are the different ways we can engage folks, really meet folks where they need to be, not in the sense of like, how do I educate you, but more in like, how do we do this as like, this is a community thing we do together. These are things we talk about even while we're hanging out in costume and having drinks. But also, and I think this is related to apathy and challenges, let's be real about the language access challenges we have. Let's talk about how our communities are high percentage immigrant. And it's not just about translation, it's about nuance. I can straight translate some of the things on our ballots, and they don't make sense from a cultural competence level. And is that welcoming? Did I make it accessible? Fine, I translated it. Have I made it welcoming? I don't know. Do you feel like when you arrive at a vote center that anyone cares that you're voting? And if you need help in another language, do you feel like that is a welcoming place for you? How do we make the places where we vote or the way that we vote? If I'm going to mail in my ballot, but I don't know what an assembly member does, where am I going to get that information? And I think there are two parts to it that are challenges and apathy go hand in hand. And how do we make it feel like this is a community that is trying to solve your problem? This is a community that cares that you have a voice, that cares that you engage. And how do we continue to make it fun for ourselves? Because people can tell when we're not having fun either. Right. And so that's a lot of the way I think about the work we do here at Cause, and just the reality of the challenges we face, but also that we can have fun trying to solve that problem.
Thank you, Nancy. And I want to turn next to you, Bob, because APIAVote plays such a significant role. You all just led the presidential town hall in Philadelphia that had around 1,000 people join, along with Vice President Kamala Harris. How do you tackle voter apathy, and why do you think voting is so important for this particular election?
That's such an important question, and you know, in thinking about voter apathy, I really feel like that's one way to describe it. But I see so much, especially when we talk about the youth sector. I see so much passion about things, and it really boils down to frustration, I think, because you know, people feel that their government or their, you know, choices, whichever way they go, aren't responsive enough and aren't addressing their specific concern. And I think that bubbles up into a frustration that people have, and a way of expressing that is to say, you know, no, I don't like anybody because my expectations are so far from being met. But you know, that just means an organization like ours has to kind of double down on voter education. We're a C3. We can't really direct people one way or another, other than to provide, you know, our take on the issues themselves and how they, you know, might be impacting the community. So, you know, the town hall was a great example of, you know, bringing together a lot of people in the community. You know, at the time she was still not the main person, and a lot of the frustration I think people had was that they just didn't see the energy there, and the candidate that we did have, notwithstanding all the positive changes that happened under the current administration. And you saw it completely change once that nominee was changed. But going back to that town hall, there was a you know, concern from people, who say they're not going to vote because at the town hall, there was an expectation for some that they would actually get to ask questions, really, kind of probe on some issues. And unfortunately, our hands were tied in terms of the format because the vice president's office kind of dictates the kind of format they're willing to appear for that particular event. And then, on top of that, we had trouble on the Republican side getting them to even send a surrogate. So at the end of the day, as an organization, we meet them where they're at. And she wanted to give a keynote address basically. And we were, just happy that we could bring her, in front of an audience to see her. But I understand why there was frustration that, you hear town hall and you think you're going to be able to ask some probing questions and see some real back and forth. But not all opportunities are like that. And so you really have to find the events where a more probing opportunity might exist. But so there are other reasons for, people feeling like they're not getting what they need out of the candidates. Ultimately, though, I can't imagine a more stark difference right now. And, if you, for instance, take a look at Project 2025, which people may be familiar with, it's a blueprint for what happens if Trump wins the election. And it's pretty stark. And one point I'm sure that didn't go unnoticed by you was that they want to bring back the China initiative, right? So clearly, that's not going to happen if, Kamala Harris wins, and you have to weigh those issues. And even though something else that you care more passionately about isn't being adequately addressed, well, is targeting the community something that might be on your list somewhere? And if it is, look at their positions on that particular issue. So anyways, I'm kind of
Thank you.
rambling now, so
No
I'll
worries.
pass it
Thank
back.
you, Bob. I mean, it's such an important topic. And Kareena, you work specifically with the youth. Would love to get your perspective on this, especially as it relates to your ambassadors program. And I also would love if you could kind of elaborate on what are the ways that folks here in this room can get involved in the electoral process on a grassroots level. As you know, CAPAL invites students from all across the country. So would love to see what your perspective is on that.
So I think two parts to your question, right? So I think the first part, at least, I think Bob touched on it. So that's why I wanted Bob to go first to provide some context before I go in depth. I think honestly, like also, again, this is from APIAVote's partners and the partners we have and the students we've talked to. So we have 30-minute check-ins with some of these students or ambassador monthly group calls. So I think way back when we started the first one, I think is very different to the conversations that we've had at the summit or even conversations I'm having now with some of the students. I think it varies, right? Depending first on geographically where the student's coming from. So say East Coast, if they're coming from the East Coast, depending on what state, right? I think some of the students are very, I think they're very engaged with their community. I think they're very engaged and they're also like the resources are very accessible to them. Whereas sometimes like when I went to Michigan and they had the Midwest Asian American Student Conference, that was very different, right? Because they are still trying to get in touch with their community, right? So I just want to preface too, the student experience is very different, right? Like I'm sure each of you have your own opinions, your own thoughts that are also shaped by your own background, right? And I think with like, yeah, to be transparent, there's a lot of students, some students, I wouldn't say all, that don't feel like voting, right? But then I think that's also where Bob's right. I think voter education, but I think it's more about student empowerment is how I've been framing it, because I as well was learning a little bit more. I also think, again, like voting's just the one tool. I think there's also several other components, and I'm sure that a lot of other nonprofit orgs who work with youth would agree too. I think, part of it and bridging both answers together in a little smush sandwich like the grassroots level, right? I think like how, for example, like really quick show of hands. Like how many of you done grassroots level organizing? It's okay if you haven't. Yeah, so there's like a couple hands in the room, right? And that might not be something you're interested, or you might not have that access to that, right? And I think getting involved even in the electoral process in your grassroots level is difficult. How you can do that is, yes, people will say like, yes, you can go to your city council and you can walk up to them. I think in some areas it's difficult. Like I know our Florida students, Florida, Georgia, and Texas students have a difficult time, right? Because not that it's not accessible, I think it's just difficult to for them to engage in conversation, or because of like federal policies that are in place, right? Whereas our students in California, like Nancy, I'm sure like our students in California, they feel like you talked about, right? Like the local elections, most of our California students are very deeply dived into the local stuff that's happening, whether it be in Orange County or even across the board in San Diego, or forget where, UCLA and such, or even like community colleges in California, right? But that's just the culture there. So I think to answer your question, I think one, there's a good portion, like a small amount of students, I would say, right, across the nation. And obviously, I'm sure not everyone here might have social media, but there's like obviously so many student movements happening. So there's that. But I still think there's a good amount of students that are still understanding their empowerment and what power means to them, right? Like the concept of power is so, I don't know, I feel like some people don't realize the students, like the student themselves might not realize that they have power because maybe that hasn't been articulated. Maybe like you haven't seen someone your age that has had that power, or has had a candidate address your needs, right? But I think a student utilizing their right to vote or even make a political action, I think in itself is part of the voting process. And there's a whole voting wheel, right? I'm not going to go fully in depth with it, but I think, again, voting's that process, and also diving deep into your city council, your local electorate issues that are happening. Like, for example, in New Jersey, some students are worried about, or like, there's a water crisis, right? There's lead in the water. All the students are super upset about it. They formulated, there's something called a Newark Water Coalition, right? And then in California, some of our students are concerned about some issues regarding, I believe, like within their school, specifically like getting even Asian American studies mandated for like some of the schools, not like the big schools like UCLA, but smaller schools, right? So I think it varies. But I hope I answered your question a little bit.
No, absolutely. And just to dig a little bit on, especially your youth engagement, I mean, how much of a difference does it make, the youth vote
Yeah.
nationally?
I feel like it makes a pretty big difference. I think like, I mean, I don't see anyone nodding, but I think that I'm not gonna sit here on this panel and say it doesn't, because right, I'm like you guys, right? I was once in college. I also feel like it does matter because, again, like everyone says, the youth shapes the nation, right? But I also think that you're sitting here, you're intentionally sitting here, whether or not you were required to, you were obviously sitting here to learn more about what we do, right? And I think the whole general thing is the youth want to see the world in a better place. They want to see it better, they want it to improve, they want to help people, and they want to see improvement overall. So I think it matters, yes. 100%.
Thank you, Kareena. Well, I want to be mindful of time. Before we go into audience Q&A, I want to pass back to Hannah for our event survey.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Gisela, Bob, Kareena, Nancy. Let's give a huge round of applause for our amazing panelists for such a great discussion tonight. So we're going to go into the audience survey. For our in-person attendees, we'll be handing out paper copies that also have a QR code if you prefer to do that. We do ask for all of our attendees, whether you're virtual or in person, to complete the survey. Your responses do help keep our Washington Leadership Program, as well as our other summer programming, running year after year. And then shortly afterwards, we will go into audience Q&A as well. So for our virtual attendees, you can drop any questions that you have in the chat box. For our in-person attendees, y'all can hang tight, and we will be passing out microphones shortly.
Thank you, Hannah.
And I think as we're filling out the survey, if anyone in the room has a question, feel free to raise your hand and I can hand the mic over to you. Okay, Angel, awesome. I'll hand it over to you.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you guys so much for speaking today. Nancy, shout out. See you soon. So I just had a question since we are on the topic of 2024 elections specifically. And like as someone who's young, I'm not eligible to vote since I'm not American, but something I think that has been on like the topic, the like top of the discussion topic recently has been like the fact that the US is such a like two-party system. And I think now, like this year, I think that's especially come into play. We have like third-party candidates such as like Jill Stein, Cornel West, etc., JFK Jr. question mark. But still, like we're still hearing this rhetoric of like it's either red or blue. If you don't vote blue, you're essentially like voting red. And so I just wanted to hear your guys's kind of your perspective on this two-party system. If you see there's like any potential for tangible change for like the US to move towards something that isn't just a two-party system. And if so, like how can we as youth mobilize for that? What can we do? And if like people are voting third party, what are the consequences slash benefits of that? And like at the end of the day, I feel like that also ties into the question of like, does our vote matter, right? If we are voting third party. So what is your perspective on that? Just wanted to hear more about that. Thank you.
Angel, that's such a wonderful question. I almost want to log it down and make sure it's posted up on their websites. Nancy, would you like to kick us off on that?
Sure. I will say my feeling about this question in particular related to our work here at Cause is going to feel like not an answer. I think for me, engagement is important. And if having a third party means that our communities will feel like they have a voice because they have options, that is different. That is actually a level of engagement I would welcome the discussion for. Right. If we want to talk about strategies, I'm not going to do it as a nonpartisan organization right now. But what I will say is there are so many ways that we could be engaging in these conversations. There are so many ways that for me, it's still a win if we have an increase in turnout. Increase in turnout because someone resonates with what is happening is an opportunity for us to continue engagement. And so I do believe that there is something about having an opportunity to know for yourself what you want to do with your vote. And there are so many things on the ballot that your decision in one place doesn't have to be the only reason you go to the ballot, right? And I also feel pretty strongly that this is not a test. You are actually allowed to leave some things blank. So if the thing that's preventing you from voting is that you don't want to do something, that may not be the popular idea, but for me, I'm like, I want to get everyone to a place where they want to vote, where they want to talk about it, where they want to ask this question. And so I think it is important that we continue to have the discussion about what will happen. And I will encourage both the education of what it means to have another third party candidate, as well as what it means for us to actually show up and vote. 18 to 35-year-olds in California are voting at 15%. And so I don't know. I think there's so much room for growth there. There's so much room to say what you want as a group, because the over 55-year-olds are voting at 65%. And so I think that there's another hurdle. And so anything that gets people excited and engaged, I think is a step forward.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I do want to dig a little deeper into the stat you just shared. In terms of how much power the youth can have with the elected officials, does that low voter turnout for the youth, does that impact elected officials' perception on how seriously they need to take this demographic?
I mean, I'd love to hear from my peers on the panel, but I will say, from a strategy perspective, yes, if any of us, including the AAPI communities, any demographic of us does not show up to vote, then we are not the person who put that person in office. We are also then not the person who will get that person out. And I think changing that narrative is important. And it's one of the reasons I think we should vote. And you can already hear from the way I'm talking now, like the vast difference in how I feel from even 4 years ago. Right. Like, and so I do believe it's important for us to show up and say that we want to be part of the conversation, say that we have an opinion about it. And then when we make the phone call to our elected official, tell them that we know our community shows out to vote. It's a different narrative for sure.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Bob, I want to dig back into Angel's questions and see how far I can push you as a nonprofit, because there are some logistical, frank discussions that can be put on this. So just lifting up some of the points that Angel so wonderfully lifted up, which is, you know, what about the two-party system? Are there ways that the youth who don't agree with it can mobilize to have a change in the future? But also in the immediate, within the existing climate, you know, if you vote third party, what does that mean for your vote? Is it a vote that essentially won't impact the presidential elections?
I mean, just starting with that, it certainly impacts the election. And you know, and you can't take that vote for granted, obviously. So you don't know which way it may have impacted the election, but it certainly, the sheer percentage of that vote, assuming it could go either way, would certainly in a lot of places represent, you know, the margin of victory. And so, and if I don't know if the 15% of youth voting is California or national, but I mean, obviously, if you bump that up to, you know, 50% even, then you're talking about some very significant numbers, which have to be paid attention to by elected officials. But you know, if they're not worried about that sector voting, then you know, they almost get a pass, you know, on the issues that you care about. I think, you know, a great example of you know, a high point of engagement was, you know, after many of these horrible school shootings, and you know, students really organized. I know that kind of energy is hard to maintain, but you know, it's not a vote that's you know, going one way or another. Obviously, it seems like it would be either a third party candidate or you know, or if you know, the Democratic candidate was, you know, at least in that direction, you know, maybe the vote would end up there. But it has to be earned. And if a third party candidate is doing a better job, then that's a great way. Now, I would have to say, you know, it's a great place to, you know, make a statement in the primary season, but it is, you know, for better or worse, a two-party system right now. We don't have, you know, a parliamentary system where smaller parties can actually get a foothold. And so, you know, for better or for worse, you know, it's, you know, if you have to look at it, you know, in kind of the worst case light, it's, you know, do you want meh or worse, you know? And so, and I know that's not very inspiring, but, you know, your vote is just one part of the entire civic engagement, civic participation spectrum. It's just one point in that spectrum. And if you really want to make change, it doesn't end with voting. Voting is just kind of your ticket to, you know, hold the elected official accountable through lobbying, through, you know, making sure his voting record is what, you know, they talked about in their campaign. And so I feel like, you know, your vote kind of, gives you license to then go badger that elected official when they veer off course. And so, maybe they'll never know exactly how you voted unless, you tell them and they believe you. But the point is, voting gives you that standing to be able to go and then petition the government, when you have certain issues that you really want to talk about.
Thank you, Baba. I appreciate the frankness. And Kareena, especially on the question Angel posed on mobilization, right? We have heard Bob talk about the limitations in the short term, but there's also ways long term to make that transformative change that goes beyond, like what Bob mentioned, just your vote. How would you respond to that based on your work on youth engagement and mobilization?
Yeah, I'm actually glad this question was brought up. I had a feeling someone would bring it up. I was talking to Bob about this earlier. So I think like I'm also not surprised by you asking that question, right? Personally, because I think like first two, there's like I'm glad that you mentioned like specifically our work in youth, because I think there's two things, right? Um, One, like obviously like I'm in this role because I'm able to communicate more with youth or, see where they're coming from because I am one of them. But then also two, there's two things happening, right? There's people that work in nonprofit atmospheres, or just in general, whether it be like in government or like being a Congress official. There's the political movements, meaning like looking at specific policies that are passed or what's happening like in a certain wave of resources, right? Like one thing I was always taught was to be open-minded. And I think then there's the second wave, right? Which is where the students are at, which is like the social media, the mobilization, all of that, right? That's happening and things that they see on their end, right? Or things that come up on their phone or such, right? So I think to answer your question, like one, because of like obviously yes, as like someone who's the APIAVote Youth Engagement Field Associate, I think personally, and also as Kareena, I think I'm very, hopeful for the youth, whatever the youth deems that they would like it to be, right? By youth, I mean like folks in the US particularly, or folks that even study here. And like you said, you're not in the US, you're not a US citizen, correct? Yeah. So like that's fine too, right? Because some of the students that we work with at APIAVote that even just volunteer or even like listen in on our workshops are international students. And I think yes, if that's something that's feasible long term, but if you want that long term, that means you really have to commit to it, right? So yes, voting is, like Bob said, the one action that you can take. But if you really want, like a lot of students I've seen go and organize and protest, and they also vote, right, to see things change. But I think some folks have been also warped into, it's a conversation some of the ambassadors and I have had, where there's certain aspects to protesting where it's like there's the aesthetics of protesting where some students don't know fully what they're protesting about, but then there's the actual organizers who they're protesting the issues, but they're also discussing it with their elected officials in that county. Like they'll go to the office, they'll meet with them, they'll sit down, right? And I think long term, obviously with the youth, if that's something they want, and as the youth collectively become on the same page, right? Just as much as that stat you shared, Nancy, where folks above a certain age all voting higher, right? I think when it gets to that point, yeah, maybe there's possible shifts for change.
Thank you so much, Kareena. Now we know, especially for CAPAL, that there's this intersection, right? Where we're working with the next generation of leaders, but also you carry your own identity being part of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. I'd love to hear from you all along, and please include any last remarks and responses to each other. But what's your perspective on the AANHPI voter bloc? How has it been historically viewed as a voter bloc in comparison to what it is today? And I'll leave open to anyone who wants to tackle first.
Well, it's just a construct, right? It's not something that actually really exists. We talk it up a lot, but because voting in numbers is important. That's the currency of, getting things done in this town. How many votes is your, community, your organization, whatever the breakdown, how many votes is that block giving us? And so, on the one hand, we create this construct of AANHPI. On the other hand, we know the reality is we're not a monolith. And in fact, we need to disaggregate more than as much as we need to aggregate. So, because every community has different needs, different cultural understanding and backgrounds and histories from their home country. And that all can't be washed aside either. So there is a bit of a tension and conflict between trying to say we're all one big group, which we know we're not. I mean, look at all the language, access issues, as Nancy was talking about. Those are real barriers to our ability to be involved in the civic process. But there are common, it's a common hurdle. Hate crimes, it's a common a problem. People aren't, the perpetrator of a hate crime isn't really trying to determine your ethnicity. They just think you look like a foreigner because you're Asian. We have to understand there are commonalities that we have to accept and use in order to have a bigger political voice, but all the same time recognizing, our diversity.
Thank you, Bob. And Nancy, if I can throw that back at you, and if you happen to have any interesting stats, would love that as well.
Oh, I wish I had more interesting stats. I think there's a few things that I think are important that we're seeing here in California. And I think are the reason why I know it's important for us to continue to strive towards not just representation, but real community engagement and voice. We are finding that we have a interesting number, a high number of APIs running for office here at the city or at the state and federal levels, city, state, federal, all three. And in Los Angeles City, there are two areas where there is an API candidate at all three of those levels, in both Koreatown zip code and an Eagle Rock zip code. So Koreatown, not just Korean American, but a large number of Koreans there. And then in Eagle Rock, a high number of Filipino Americans living there. And what we found is in the primary that our turnout was less bad than everyone else's. So if we want to talk about statistics, I know that's not the greatest one. But, we were disappointed in general turnout in the primary, but it was so fascinating to see that in the zip code where we had overlap of candidates, that the numbers were better for our communities. And, I think a lot about myself as like a younger Asian woman in Ohio and how my state currently has a 2% API population. And my hope of representation is very different. My feeling around voice is very different than here, where I'm seeing not just people run for office, but also for me, very tangibly, Congress member Ted Lieu, who represents an area of LA City, LA County here, is also from my hometown. And that this is the place where someone who looks like me, comes from my community, grew up where I grew up, could actually represent and get to office from stakeholders here. And so I think there's so many opportunities and interesting ways to have voice. But the most important thing is that these candidates aren't just people who look like me. They're people who I see at community events. They're people who I have met at different types of meetings, different moments of tragedy, different opportunities for us to celebrate. And that engagement with our community is key. And that is the kind of voting block I think is important.
Just while I have it on my mind, in terms of statistics and kind of tracking, the changes and where the Asian American community stands on various issues. We did just issue our 2024 Asian American voter survey with AJC and API data and ARP. And so I don't know if our website will pop up later, but I would encourage people to go there and look at this survey because it will break down kind of voting trends, not just this year, but we have these going back, to 2012, I think. But to kind of address your question a little bit, the one of the big things in our community is, it's the fastest growing. Obviously, that's because of immigration, and that's like a whole nother element within the community. The immigrants and whether they've been here a generation or more, and that tends to kind of point to which way they might be voting politically or leaning, and that just very general, this huge generalization, but the longer people have been here, the more kind of progressive they've become. But anyways.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Kareena, do you have any last remarks?
Yeah, I was gonna bring up that point. So I'm glad you touched it. That's why I pulled my phone out to check stats. But I think also like the AANHPI voter bloc, right? Like what a large acronym, right? I think part of that too, and I've talked about this with Christine, I think we're also formulating our own internal strategy as an org because, right, Kamala Harris is an Indian and a Black woman, both. So I think that, dual identity is very important. And I think too, that goes into, what some of our ambassadors have brought up to me, especially the South Asian or Southeast Asian population of, having and navigating those conversations with the student body when they're doing their voter engagement action plans, like voter edge drives or anything. How do you interact with them? Because they themselves feel excluded, to be frank, right? And I'm sure like maybe some of you are aware or some not, but I think broadly, when you say Asian, most of the South Asian community or brown Asians in particular, right, to be more inclusive of the entire diaspora, they feel very excluded. So I think that's something to understand as well with the voter bloc, especially with Kamala being the front face right now. And a lot of Indian communities across the nation, not just saying youth, but just Indian communities or just anyone within the Southeast or South Asian diaspora in general, right? Organizing, other nonprofits are organizing and showing support. So I think that's super important in the voting bloc to consider. And then other else than that, I think my last remarks would just be, I hope that you also take time to talk to us after and connect with us, but also look at the resources that, Nancy has, as well as APIAVote, and see where you can learn more. And also check that survey because that survey is very interesting. The API data, if not many folks know, APIAVote works very closely with, and it helps you understand more about the broader nation outside of your state, like how youth are feeling about immigration, how say how Koreans are feeling specifically about this particular issue, right? It's a very in-depth survey that I think not many people know about, and it's good to just read up, right? Because I think that can also shape your relationship with voting as well as empower you more to possibly see other opportunities for yourself or even grassroots organizing. So just keep an open mind.
Thank you, Kareena. And before we close out, I did want to also just touch base on that question on apathy. I want to share just a quick story about my conversation with a documentary filmmaker, because my nonprofit specifically works with a community that is directly targeted. I work with folks who work at universities who are AANHPI. And we see this real attack happening right now in our country with this community, right? We see attacks from the employment side, criminalization of normal activities at universities, alien land laws that won't allow people coming from certain countries, including China, from owning land, preventing international students coming from Asian countries from coming to study and work in the United States. And for the Asian American community being predominantly foreign born, this will ultimately lead to less new Americans, less naturalized citizens. So we see a very cohesive attack on our community having this voting power in the United States. And I remember that reporter asking me, why are you still so optimistic and working with this community that's facing, such serious attacks, especially when you're talking about criminalization? And one of the things I told her was I had immigrated here to the United States from the Philippines, from one of the most crime-ridden, poorest parts of the country. And so regardless of whatever state of nature we're seeing here in the United States, immigrating here had really saved my life and the lives of many of my family members. And I went on to work with many asylum seekers and refugees who were escaping war, who were escaping being targeted by a man who just wouldn't let them go, and there were just no resources in their country to be able to have that protection, or escaping gang violence. And all of them were seeking protection and a haven here in the United States. And so it really reminds me that America here, regardless of its faults, can still become a safe haven for a lot of people. And it's been a safe haven for many of us and many of our parents. But for it to be able to be like that in the future, it means we have to kind of get our hands dirty, vote, and for the people we disagree with, make sure we build up more power than they have. So we just thank you all for listening to this discussion. But I also want to give just a big round of applause to our panelists, because I will say the work that they are doing right now is the most important work in the civil rights community. So if we can just give them a round of applause.
Can we just squeeze that
Oh,
in?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a student at Georgetown, also youth ambassador for APIAVote's program. So I got to be in Philly a few weeks ago, which was very lovely. But Bob, I was struck by you saying that, like, when you were talking about the national partnership program, you're talking about how you're like trying to get a partner in Alabama. And I'm actually from Alabama.
Oh.
And I was very fascinated because I've actually done like a deep dive into API organizations in Alabama. Basically, like found it's really inaccessible. Like there's like 5 that I found online and they all had like really old websites. Like there was no way to get in contact with them. And I'm from Auburn, Alabama, which is not even like one of the main places that would have like any kind of like API community organizing. And it just made me think about like how you guys are really trying to expand across like all 50 states, and all of the states are obvious that you guys like have a lot of partners, and I'm sure, but I was wondering if you guys could talk a bit about how you approach building up like these organizing skills and like this capacity in states, or even like just in areas where there's so little representation,
Mhm.
and like how you guys approach that. Like what's your philosophy in trying to get Asians in Alabama to vote?
No, that's a great question, and we need to connect you with. We have an organizer in Florida who's been traveling to Alabama to try and make connections, and she recently has, right? And so, but I would love for you guys to connect and compare notes, because that's going to help her a lot, and your guidance would be much appreciated. But I think that, in any state that we go to that, doesn't have a huge community, it oftentimes is more about, a small, Tongan American Association in Utah, or in Iowa, a Southeast Asian group that may only do, uh, different festivals every year, but that's the extent of their outreach, but it's still outreach. And so, a lot of times and this is really Christine, our executive director, will do this, but begin developing a relationship with that person who clearly knows how to organize because they do this work. It just happens to be for a festival, and she'll you know, really explain how organizing for something like that is like organizing for anything else. And that's really kind of the backbone of civic engagement organizing, the way you do outreach, the way you you know, talk to the community. And so it actually converts nicely in a lot of cases, because you know, the community organization might not think of themselves as being organizers or doing civic engagement work, but their skill set easily converts to that if, you know, they just get a little more background and training on what that means. So you know, but I'm serious, we need to get your card later, but yeah.
I'll just also add to that, because Hannah and I have talked about this. I think Hannah and I are, I think, the main people at APIAVote that travel the most,
Right.
besides Christine. But aside, because Christine takes care more of like overall ED, like executive director things, probably similar to Nancy as well. But I think Hannah and I, from APIAVote, she's the Florida field organizer. That's what Bob was saying. And I think she and I are the only people that travel the most. So like Christine will, I'll go to Michigan, or I'll go to Connecticut, or I'll go to like some other state. I think when Hannah and I talk all the time, and people are so surprised, like, oh, I met this like random person on some random restaurant, and I'll just be talking to them, right? But it's that's how it is, right? That's generally, like, I feel like it's like a secret code that people are just like hiding, which I don't know why, right? It's just simple. You just talk to people. It's really like putting yourself out there. Like, I think Hannah and I happened to meet some student organizer that I had met at literally the most random conference ever a couple years ago, and then they had shown up again in Florida, right? And that actually happened to be an ambassador today. So when I met them at the KASU conference when I got this job, I was like, wait, why do you look familiar? And they're like, wait, are you Kareena Salvi? And I'm like, who are you? And then like that was a genuine interaction, right? And then I told them, I was like, oh, I'm APIAVote, blah, blah, blah. And then from there, they were telling me their story, and they were telling me they heard of APIAVote through Hannah Locop, because she's like all over Florida, right? And then through that, I was like, oh, well, why don't you join our ambassador program, like this and that and these resources? So it's like genuinely all about putting yourself out there, right? In those spaces, like signing up for those conferences, right? And for students especially, they have all these scholarships or stipends as well to make it accessible, right? And I think through that, that's how Hannah was able to find those Alabama folks, right? And she, especially, and I feel like we're the type of people to put ourselves in the most obscure places, especially at APIAVote. Like, we go in the most obscure and weird places that like other like people might not go. And then we talk to every single person, like no matter what, or we give our email, like no matter what. And no matter what, we always are very big on, I think, you know, if email is not accessible, phone calls, I think, is big for Hannah and I. So a lot of people would just be like, hello. And I'm like, who is this? And then they'll be like, oh, I'm blank from the state. I met you at this. And I'm like, oh, yeah. So I think that's like the most transparent answer, you know? And I think if you're having a hard time finding where those spaces are, like, not to say Google's your best friend, but I think following like IGs is what Hannah and I've been doing, like going on Instagram. So we'll follow like this East Coast Broad org, or like the Tongan Student Association in the Sedso, California school. And then we'll see like, oh, there's this other club. And then you Google that club, and all the colleges have their colleges emails public or accessible, or you can call like student engagement office is what I've been doing. And then they'll just like be like, who are you? And I'll give my credentials, and then, you know, have a convo. But I think that is a lost art in today's world, talking to people. It's a lost art, but it's also like caring is such a lost art as well, right?
So I think the message I'm getting here is if you want Kareena at your state bothering people, just reach out to her and she'll fly down.
But we'll definitely connect. I'll give you that contact.
Thank you, Kareena. Nancy, did you have any remarks for the question?
No, I mean, I think it's so fun to hear my peers just talk about all that is possible, right? Like, and I think that I just continue to really look forward to not just that one-on-one touch point that I feel like Kareena is really talking about, but also all of the bigger strategies that we all have running through our minds right now as we go into November. And so just really appreciative of having this opportunity to speak to everyone. Happy to also, I think it's funny, I think as an ED, I continue to really want to be accessible and have a lot of touch points. So very open to any conversations around not just our program, but the amazing group of programs that are out there for students right now. And so really appreciative to everyone on this panel and all the organizations who continue to invest in all these fun youth opportunities. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I appreciate our panelists, and let's just give them one last thank you.
Hey, thank you, everyone. That was a very inspiring and empowering conversation. Thank you to Gisela, Bob, Kareena, and Nancy. Nancy, nice seeing you again. It's been a while. It was a very thoughtful conversation this evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight in DC or online. If you enjoyed our final 6th WLP session of the summer, be sure to stay up to date about upcoming events and programs at CAPAL. You can visit our website at capal.org and view all of our upcoming events, follow us on social media, and learn more about our S&I programs. Our S&I programs recently have now been continuing on through the fall and the spring sessions. So we have like a rolling application portal, and we do welcome applicants year-round for placements. Thank you to our 2024 sponsors, and special thank to our Mayor's Office on Asian Pacific Islander Affairs for your continued support for our programs and continue to provide opportunities for AANHPIs in public service. A very special thank you to our office interns this summer, Kenny, Chingun, and Marissa, and also our summer volunteers that help make the summer's programming possible. To our panelists, if you could just stay back for a quick group photo, that would be wonderful. And we have a little bit more time. If you'd like to network or catch up or ask some more questions from our panelists, you're welcome to do so. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.